This is my 4.1 Ethical and Legal Issues assignment by Harry Baker. So the background. So during the war, several people were held as prisoners in Nazi concentration camps, and they used the prisoners to conduct experiments on, and this is obviously against their choice, as they wouldn't do it by choice. So during the time, they were given no care and thought about, which is against any research should be done. The purpose of the experiment was to help the Nazis. An experiment they conducted was to understand the different temperatures, and people were submerged into different temperatures to see at what point they become unconscious and perhaps to the point of death. Clearly, the prisoners were subjected to a lot of physical and emotional harm, even to the point of death. So prior to 1947, there was no accepted code of conduct for human experiments, whatever the research was for. However, after the Second World War finished, the Nuremberg trials were going on. People reviewed how the Nazis treated people, and what occurred from that was called the Nuremberg Code 1947, which included 10 points that a researcher must consider when taking into consideration when planning and conducting an experiment on humans. So a summary of the 10 are on the screen. So consent of human subjects is essential and should have the free power of choice, should be not random, research should be done, avoid unnecessary physical and mental harm, should it be done if death is a possibility, risk shouldn't overcome the outcome, correct facilities are used, qualified experiments, participants are able to drop out, and the scientists are able to stop. So after that, there was the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, which the World Medical Association created. It was another version of the code. So therefore, because of these two changes, we now have a very recognised set of ethical principles that researchers must abide by. So ethics are moral principles that govern a person's behaviour or the conducting of an activity, and it's almost like what's right and wrong of life, and the expectations of the researchers that nobody in their researches should come to any physical or emotional harm. Legal aspects are working within the boundaries of a civil law and what they state to be right and wrong. So BASES is the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science, and it's critical for researchers for many reasons. BASES has determined a code of conduct for researchers, and they must abide by them. It's also the key organisation in sport where sports scientists can be accredited, which is very good for someone's status. You also become a very trusted researcher. So ethical and legal definitions. So there are key ethical and legal issues which are defined. So BASES, as I described earlier, BASES is the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science, and it's a key organisation in sport where researchers can be accredited if they fit a certain criteria, and they outline the ethical and legal issues. So institutional ethics and review committee. So organisations might have an ethics committee, and this is a group of people who are independent of that particular study, who are all specialists. Ethical clearance. So an ethical clearance application must be filled out, and a committee will review the application, either granting ethical clearance, granting it with minor amendments, major amendments, or not granting ethical clearance at all. Risk benefit analysis. So this really helps to weigh up that you'll be putting the participants in some hard situations, but it's worth it and the benefits outweigh the risks. So volunteers, so they should be volunteers taking part. They shouldn't be forced or pressured to take part. They're willing to do it. Informed consent, so the participants know exactly what they're going to experience, why they're going to do it, what the possible risks are, and they sign a document saying they're happy to go ahead. Right to withdraw, so if the participants change their mind in the study, they can stop at any point, and that's okay. Health and medical screening questionnaire. So this should be complete to make sure that they're suitable and not in a position that would be harmful if they partake in the research. Participant disclaimer. So if the researcher feels the participant is of a concern, they must refer them to the GP for a check. This will protect them if they still choose to take part. Equality and impartiality. So to preserve the reputation of sports science research must remain unbiased and impartial. Research responsibility. So their main job is to protect the participants, anticipate ethical issues before the study, Monitor during the session competence and data handling respect with the results. So deception. So if you're not allowed to deceive your participants, whether you forget to tell them something, omission, or whether you lie and not tell them the truth, which is commission. Health and safety. So the researcher must ensure that everyone is safe, including doing a suitable warm-up and cool-down, check the equipment being used, a risk assessment for any practical activity, just to make sure everything's safe. Confidentiality and anonymity. So with the information that comes from the study, it might be inappropriate to share the information if it contains personal details to the public without their permission. So it's important to research abides by the rules of confidentiality. So data protection. So they must only share information that is important to the study that they're undertaking. Data that is collected is protected under Data Protection Act 1998 and should be kept in a safe computer with a secure password and should only be shared if the participants consent. Scientific misconduct. So the researchers should not be biased and cheat in any way with the results and not ignore any results that doesn't agree with what they want. So a consequence of not working ethically and legally. So ethical training. So if there was any issues in the experiment, you might be told by bases that the researcher might need to have some ethical training. Law. So if the researcher breaks the law or harms a participant, they might be subjected to prison sentences. Suspension. So the researcher might be suspended from their role of a researcher or their job. Physical and emotional harm. So there is no way that any participant should leave with any harm. The researcher should debrief the participants to make sure that they're totally okay before they leave. Fines. So they might be fined significant amount of money, particularly if a person gets harmed. Professional or research credibility. So they might lose their basis accreditation and professional role, and then basis accreditation, as I just said, this can be lost. So scenario 1, so a study of correlation between body composition and the gymnast's performance. So a good practice from the scenario was professional conduct, as the researcher didn't judge anybody's ability or body composition. This is important because if they did, they might have led to emotional harm for the participant, therefore being professional, helping avoid any self-doubt by the participant. Also, health screening was good, as the researcher conducted one before the experiment to make sure all the participants were suitable to take part. So this is good as it will avoid any problems before they start. Lastly, they brief the participants, which is good, so they'll be like fully aware of what they're doing at the time and what's involved in the experiment. However, there's some bad practice in the scenario, which as you can see, I put release data onto the internet so everyone can see. Therefore, they broke the Data Protection Act. So this would impact the participants because they didn't know that the information was being shared, and this might cause physiological harm as they feel like the results should be private and confidential. Also, for the researchers, some consequences of their actions could mean that they are fined. Parents could complain, which could lead to them being fired or suspended from an organisation. Another bad thing that the researcher didn't get informed consent from the parents, as this is bad as they might not want their children partaking in the experiment. Also, because they didn't get permission, they didn't offer the right to withdraw, as they made the gymnastics partake until the end. So this goes against the researchers' code of conduct, and the consequence of this action for the participants could be physical or emotional harm, as they didn't stop for the researcher, and they could lose their the researcher could lose their basis accreditation, and therefore they would lose their job and future hopes of a job. So scenario 2. So an experiment's researchers investigating the role of ice baths in aiding the recovery of maximal intensity gymnastics routine. There will be two groups of gymnasts completing the same routine, then getting into different temperature baths, one's colder than the other, and they won't know which one's the cold one and which one's the cooler one. So some good practice was that the researcher gave the participants the right to withdraw, as one participant stopped as they touched the water, so they just stopped and that was allowed. So this is important because it made them feel like they're not being forced and they could stop whenever they want. Another good thing is confidentiality, as the researchers said that the results will be anonymous and also used only for the experiment and not being sent anywhere else. So this would avoid the participants suffering from an emotional harm as the results are secure. But there are some bad practices, which our medical screening questionnaire wasn't filled out, which meant the researcher didn't know if any participants had any medical problems. This could have a massive impact on the experiment if something happened to a participant, but also the researcher, therefore, they might be that they need some ethical training, or that they could get fined, or worse, something severe might happen to the participant, and they could be looking at a prison sentence if that happens. So another bad thing was deception, because they omitted to tell the participant everything, as they didn't know what bath they were going into. So this could put physical or emotional harm on the participant because they're not fully aware what's going on during the experiment. So consequences of this, the researcher might again lose their job, or maybe their BASIS accreditation, which will make it harder to get a job in the future. So scenario 3. So a researcher was comparing the flexibility of two groups of young female gymnastics to measure the effectiveness of different stretches. However, the researcher forced her participants to stretch for a specific amount of time without telling them. So a good practice from this scenario was that all the participants were volunteers. They're willing to take part. This is important for the results of the experiment because they will be genuine, and this is different to the researcher like paying someone, for example, just to do what they want and get the results they want to hear. Another good thing is that all the participants gave informed consent, therefore they're happy and they understood what was going to happen. So this would avoid any people not knowing what they're doing and dropping out because they find that it's harder than they wanted. However, there are some bad practices, as the researcher didn't give the right to withdraw, as you can see at the end part, saying that they were forced to stretch. Therefore, this goes against the code of conduct and could lead to consequences for anyone partaking, for everyone, as the participant could get physical harm and they could injure themselves, as this links to the second bad practice, health and safety. So the experiment could not be allowed to happen and a researcher could get fined. So lastly, deception was another bad thing because commission happened, as a researcher said it would be about how far they stretch and not the amount of time they stretch for. Therefore, the consequences of the researcher could be fined, they could be suspended from their job as they lied to participants, and the participants could suffer from emotional harm if they know they've been lied to. So scenario 4. So a qualitative study of attitudes towards overweight young female gymnasts. So good practice within this was the Data Protection Act was abided by because the researcher put all the results in a locked computer with a secure password. And this also links to the researcher's responsibilities as they handled it with respect. This is important because before the experiment, the researcher said that the results would not be punished anywhere, and that was true. Another good thing was that the young gymnast was supervised the whole time and the researcher didn't leave the room. This shows that they were professional throughout the experiment and it was to avoid injury for the participants. However, some bad practice was that the researcher wasn't very professional because they shouted the results to one another from one side of the room to the other. This is a problem because the people that they were talking about was in the room and they were listening. Therefore, this will cause emotional harm to the participants as they are hearing negative information about themselves. So another bad thing that about the scenario is the people they were talking about didn't give consent that they could talk about them. So this would affect the participant as I just discussed, but also be major consequences for the researcher because it could lead to them being fired, suspended because they went against the code of conduct and the researcher's responsibilities. This would also lead to the researcher losing their BASIS accreditation, which means it will be harder to get more jobs in the future. So overall, there are many good and bad points that came out from the scenarios, but most importantly, the consequences that were for the participant, researcher, and experiment.